In August 1942, a Hollywood actress sat in a rented room with an avant-garde composer, arranging strips of paper punched with holes across a table, trying to make two machines switch radio frequencies in perfect lockstep so that a torpedo could not be jammed by the enemy. The actress was Hedy Lamarr, MGM's reigning screen beauty, and the composer was George Antheil, a man once notorious for staging a concert with 16 synchronized player pianos and an actual airplane propeller on stage. The question this story has to answer isn't whether Hedy Lamarr was clever. She plainly was. It's what she actually did, what got exaggerated after her death, and why a genuine, well-documented act of wartime ingenuity somehow needed to be inflated into the secret mother of Wi-Fi before anyone thought her story was interesting enough to tell. Was there a real invention buried under the legend, and if so, what exactly was it? Who built it, and where did the truth end and the myth begin? Start with the woman before the myth. Hedy Lamarr was born Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler in Vienna in 1914, the only child of a bank director father who used to walk with her explaining how machines worked, streetcars, printing presses, the guts of everyday technology, and a concert pianist mother who pushed her toward the arts. By her late teens, she was already a scandal and a sensation in European cinema, most famously in the 1933 Czech film Ecstasy, which made her name synonymous with nudity and passion long before Hollywood ever got its hands on her. That reputation is the single most important fact for understanding everything that came after, because it built the cage she spent the rest of her career trying to climb out of. Long before anyone cared what she thought about radio signals, the world had already decided the only interesting thing about her was her face. In 1937, she married Fritz Mandl, an Austrian arms manufacturer with ties to fascist governments in Italy and later Nazi Germany, a man roughly 14 years her senior who, by her own later account, controlled her, isolated her and paraded her at business dinners with military officers, engineers, and weapons buyers. Lamarr always insisted she sat silently at those dinners, decorative and half-listening, while men discussed torpedo guidance, radio control, and the vulnerabilities of remote-controlled weapons to jamming. Whether she absorbed real technical substance from those evenings or simply picked up atmosphere and vocabulary is genuinely disputed by historians. We only have her own retrospective account given decades later, and no contemporary notes from the dinners survive. But she herself said the marriage taught her one clear thing: how easily a radio signal could be jammed, and how much that mattered to weapons designed to be steered from a distance. She got out. In 1937, Lamarr fled the marriage by her own dramatic telling. She drugged a maid, put on the maid's clothes, and slipped out of the house before making her way to Paris and then London, where she talked her way onto a transatlantic liner that happened to be carrying MGM studio chief Louis B. Mayer. By the time the ship docked in New York, Mayer had her under contract, and Hedwig Kiesler became Hedy Lamarr, marketed relentlessly as the most beautiful woman in the world, a label that would follow her for the rest of her life, and in a very real sense bury everything else she ever did. Within a few years, she would be one of the most photographed women on Earth, and almost nobody photographing her would ask what she thought about engineering. Hollywood in the early 1940s did not know what to do with an actress who wanted to talk about torpedoes. Lamarr was, by multiple contemporary accounts from friends and colleagues, restless, offset, uninterested in parties, and drawn instead to tinkering. She kept a drafting table in her home, reportedly a gift or encouragement from aviation tycoon Howard Hughes, with whom she had a brief romantic and intellectual partnership. Hughes, always hungry for faster aircraft, is said to have given her simplified reference books on chemistry and engineering and let her visit his aircraft factories, and Lamarr later claimed she suggested design changes to wing shapes drawn from the aerodynamics of fish and birds. Hughes reportedly called her a genius. That claim, like much of her own retelling of her intellectual life, rests on her memory and the loyalty of people who liked the story. But the drafting table was real, and so was the reputation among a small circle of friends that the glamorous actress spent her downtime sketching inventions instead of going to premieres. The turning point came in 1940 at a Hollywood dinner party where Lamarr was introduced to George Antheil. Antheil was an American composer who had spent the 1920s in Europe styling himself as the bad boy of music. Friends with Ezra Pound and James Joyce, notorious for the riot his Ballet Mécanique caused in Paris with its battery of synchronized mechanical pianos, sirens, and airplane propellers. By 1940, he had settled into a much less glamorous life in Hollywood, writing film scores and a syndicated advice column on romance and glandular science. Yes, glandular science, because Antheil had also developed an amateur fascination with endocrinology and had co-written a book with an actual endocrinologist about how hormones supposedly shaped personality and attractiveness. He was broke, restless, and according to his own later memoir, delighted to discover that the most beautiful woman in the world wanted to talk to him about weapons systems rather than his music. What happened next is the part everyone remembers, though not always accurately. Lamarr, worried about the war and reportedly eager to contribute something beyond Bond rallies and pin-up photos, had been mulling over a specific problem. American torpedoes at the time were often radio-guided, steered from a ship or aircraft by a continuous signal on a fixed frequency, which meant an enemy who found that frequency could jam it or spoof it and send the torpedo off course. She wanted a way to make the guidance signal impossible to jam by having it hop unpredictably across many different frequencies, so fast and so erratically that an enemy receiver could never lock on. The idea itself, spread spectrum communication through frequency hopping, was not entirely without precedent. German and other researchers had floated related concepts for years, and Nikola Tesla had discussed frequency-agile radio control decades earlier. If you're the kind of viewer who wants the fully sourced, footnoted version of stories like this one, protected CTA sentence 01, because the difference between a good story and a true one is usually in the details nobody bothers to check. What Lamarr needed was a mechanism to make transmitter and receiver hop together in perfect synchrony without any enemy being able to predict the pattern. She brought the problem to Antheil because he understood something she didn't have full command of: precise mechanical synchronization. Antheil had spent years wrestling with exactly that challenge for his player piano symphony, where 16 separate machines had to stay in exact rhythmic lockstep using a punched paper roll system, the same principle used in old mechanical music boxes and pianolas. According to Antheil's own 1945 memoir, he realized almost immediately that the same kind of punched paper tape that synchronized his pianos could synchronize a radio transmitter and receiver, cycling both through an identical, prearranged sequence of frequency changes at the same moment, so that anyone without the matching paper roll would just hear meaningless noise jumping around the dial. This is worth pausing on because it reverses the usual telling. The mechanism that made the idea buildable did not come from Lamarr's imagination alone, but from Antheil's very specific, very odd musical career. So whose invention was it really? Their 1942 patent application itself credits both of them equally, and the patent record, which is the one piece of hard documentary evidence, nobody disputes, describes the invention jointly and in Antheil's engineering language, not Lamarr's. Historians who have gone back to that patent, including Rob Walters, who wrote one of the more careful biographical accounts of the invention, generally agree the collaboration was real, mutual, and roughly complementary. Her problem, their shared brainstorming, his mechanism. On June 10, 1941, Hedy Lamarr, her legal married name at the time, from a brief marriage to screenwriter Jean Markey, and George Antheil submitted a patent application for a secret communication system. It was granted on August 11, 1942, as U.S. Patent 292,387, describing a piano roll-style paper tape, identical copies loaded into both transmitting and receiving units, punched with a pattern that would shift both devices through 88 frequencies, not coincidentally, the same number as piano keys, in perfect synchrony. Here is where the story stops being a simple triumph and becomes something more interesting and more frustrating. Lamarr and Antheil didn't sell or license this to a private company. They handed it to the United States Navy, believing reasonably that a jam-proof torpedo guidance system was exactly the kind of thing the military needed in the middle of a world war. The Navy's National Inventors Council did review it, and then, according to most historical accounts, essentially shelved it. Some historians attribute this to the mechanical fragility of a paper roll system, genuinely awkward to cram into torpedo hardware built to survive underwater shock and pressure. Others point to something less flattering. Contemporary accounts and later historians, including Antheil himself in his memoir, suggested Navy officials had trouble taking the invention seriously, in part because it had a movie star's name attached to it, and reportedly one naval officer suggested Lamarr would be more useful to the war effort selling kisses for war bonds than submitting patents. an anecdote repeated often enough in the historical literature to be worth including, though it rests on second-hand recollection rather than surviving official record. So did Hedy Lamarr really invent Wi-Fi? No. And the real answer is more precise and more interesting than either the myth or its dismissal. What she and Antheil actually invented and patented was a specific mechanical 1942 anti-jamming system for radio-guided torpedoes built from a punched paper tape synchronization method borrowed directly from player pianos. Wi-Fi, formerly the IEEE 802.11 standard, finalized in 1997, was developed decades later by entirely different engineers solving entirely different problems, and it owes nothing directly to the Markey-Antheil patent, which had already expired by then and covered analog mechanical hardware, not digital packet networking. What Lamarr and Antheil did contribute genuinely and traceably was an early patented instance of the broader spread spectrum frequency hopping concept, one ingredient among many independently developed later, inside the eventual technologies that let Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and CDMA cellular networks share crowded radio spectrum without interference. That distinction, conceptual ancestor of a family of ideas, not literal inventor of a 1997 engineering standard, is the exact hoax buried in this story's own title, and now you know precisely where the truth stops and the legend begins. The consequences of that 1940s rejection played out for decades. Lamarr threw herself into war bond drives with the same intensity she'd apparently brought to the drafting table, reportedly helping raise millions of dollars for the war effort. One widely cited figure puts a single evening's pledge total near $7 million, though exact numbers vary across sources. She became publicly the beautiful actress selling kisses for bonds, privately the woman who'd handed the Navy a workable answer to torpedo jamming and watched it go into a drawer. The patent itself lapsed in 1959, before either inventor saw a dime of licensing revenue from it. Antheil, meanwhile, kept talking about the collaboration in his 1945 memoir Bad Boy of Music, framed with characteristic showmanship, never shy about claiming credit for his half of the invention, evidence against the later, lazier claim that the patent was simply a vanity credit handed to a famous face. Antheil died in 1959, the same year the patent lapsed. The idea itself did not die with the patent. Through the 1950s and into the Cold War, engineers at places like Sylvania Electronic Systems independently rediscovered and refined frequency hopping techniques for military communications, reportedly citing the Markey-Antheil patent in later filings as prior art, the clearest paper trail connecting their original idea to the technology's eventual military deployment during events like the Cuban Missile Crisis. For most of her later life, though, Lamarr got essentially no public credit for any of this. She spent the 1950s and 60s in a declining film career, 6 failed marriages in total, and increasing financial trouble, including a highly publicized 1966 shoplifting arrest that the press treated as a bigger story than anything she'd ever patented. As her son Anthony Loder would later put it in interviews defending her legacy, people had spent a lifetime asking his mother about her face and almost never about her mind. Recognition, when it finally came, arrived almost absurdly late and almost by accident. In 1997, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a digital rights organization that had started paying attention to the history of spread spectrum technology because it underpinned emerging wireless data systems, awarded Lamarr and the by then deceased Antheil its Pioneer Award. Lamarr, 82 years old and living quietly and reclusively in Florida, was reportedly so unaccustomed to being taken seriously for her mind rather than her face that she initially assumed the call was some kind of prank. She declined to attend the ceremony in person and instead let her son accept it on her behalf, with her voice patched in by phone saying, according to those present, something to the effect that it was about time. In 2014, 12 years after her death in 2000, she and Antheil were posthumously inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame, a body that had existed since 1973 without previously finding room for either of them. That gap between the 1997 award and full mainstream awareness is exactly where the myth started to inflate. Because once the internet discovered the story, it discovered it as content, not as history. And content wants a clean, dramatic headline rather than a careful account of a joint 1942 patent about torpedo guidance. Somewhere in the retelling blog posts, listicles, motivational speeches about hidden female genius, a wave of them arriving, especially around International Women's Day, features in the 2010s, The documented claim that Hedy Lamarr co-invented a frequency-hopping anti-jamming system for torpedoes quietly morphed into the puncher, and much less accurate claim that she invented Wi-Fi outright, sometimes with Bluetooth and GPS thrown in for good measure. Why did that exaggeration take hold so easily when the real story was already dramatic enough on its own? Because the exaggeration does something almost cruel to the real historical Hedy Lamarr. It replaces a documented, specific, interesting woman, someone who fled an arms dealer husband, sat at a drafting table between film shoots, teamed up with a washed-up avant-garde composer who wrote a hormone advice column, filed a real patent with the US Navy, and then got told to go sell kisses for war bonds instead, with a cartoon of a misunderstood genius who single-handedly gave the world modern wireless internet. Picture the two versions side by side. On one hand, a woman with a drafting table and a rejected patent letter. On the other, a glowing internet graphic claiming she invented the device in your pocket. The real story indicts real institutions, a Navy bureaucracy that couldn't separate a movie star's face from an engineer's idea, a studio system with no vocabulary for an actress with a drafting table, a press that found her shoplifting arrest more newsworthy than her patent. The inflated story indicts nobody and requires no evidence beyond a viral graphic. Lamarr herself, in the rare interviews late in life where she discussed the invention at all, never claimed to have built Wi-Fi or anything resembling it. She talked about torpedoes, about the Navy's rejection, about Anthel's piano rolls, and mostly about wishing people had asked her about her mind while she was young enough to enjoy the asking. What's left, once you strip away both the old dismissal and the new exaggeration, is a genuinely remarkable and fully human story that doesn't need embellishment to earn attention. A woman who escaped a controlling marriage, filed a legitimate wartime patent with a forgotten composer, got turned away by the very institution she was trying to help, and lived just long enough to hear, in a phone call she almost didn't believe was real, that someone had finally noticed. It was never a small story. It just took the world about 80 years, and one badly overcorrected myth to notice the true one.